In the biting cold of December 1946, while America was beginning to embrace the optimism of a post-war world, a very different future was being charted in the cloistered heart of the Kremlin. Inside Joseph Stalin's office on Old Square, a meeting convened that would condemn tens of thousands to a frozen hell. The documents from this meeting would remain buried for decades in the most secret archives of the Federal Security Service. Present were the architects of the Soviet security state, Minister of Internal Affairs Sergei Kruglov, Minister of Railways Ivan Kovalyov, and the infamous deputy chairman of the State Defense Committee Lavrenti Beria. Spread across the table was a map of Siberia's northern territories. A stark red line drawn with the certainty of absolute power connected two remote towns, Salekhard and Igarka. Stalin traced the line with his finger, his voice low and deliberate. He spoke of a new transport corridor, a steel spine that would bind the western and eastern reaches of the Arctic. The official story, the one for public consumption, was a noble one to unlock the vast natural wealth of the north and to fortify the nation's defences. But in the classified documents, a darker, more paranoid objective took shape. This was to be a secret lifeline, a fallback route to evacuate strategic resources in case the country's traditional arteries were severed by a future enemy. It was a project born not of hope but of fear. On the 22nd of April 1947, the Council of Ministers of the USSR issued Decree No. 1248, authorizing the construction of the Salekhard-Igarka Railway. The document was immediately stamped top secret. It was a monumental undertaking in order to lay 3 kilometers, nearly 800 miles of track, across an unforgiving landscape of tundra swamp and permafrost. And the deadline was impossibly tight, the 1st of January 1953. Responsibility for this gargantuan task fell to the main Directorate of Railway Construction Camps of the Ministry of Internal Affairs, a bureaucratic name for a key pillar of the Gulag. Its head was Lieutenant General Ivan Dolgik. That May, in the dreaded Lubyanka headquarters in Moscow, a special construction department, number 501, was born. Its command was given to Colonel of State Security Alexei Zhurin, a man who had already proven his worth building defensive fortifications in the Far East. Zhurin was summoned directly to Beria's office on the 3rd floor of the Lubyanka. The conversation lasted 40 minutes. He emerged, clutching a folder of documents that gave him his orders, established 2 construction sectors with blinding speed, and staffed them with the only resource the state considered expendable prisoners. By the end of May, Zhurin already had 3,700 souls at his disposal, a human torrent diverted from the camps of Komy-Arkhangelsk and Karelia. The first trains packed like cattle cars arrived in Salekhard on the 28th of June 1947. 40 men were crammed into each wagon for a journey that stretched from 10 to 14 agonizing days. In the dry, clinical language of the convoy, guards' reports, sanitary conditions were described simply as critical. Upon arrival, the prisoners were herded into hastily erected barracks on the edge of town. These were mere shells against the Arctic wind, lacking the basic dignities of running water, sewage systems, or adequate heating. Simultaneously, a mirror operation unfolded in Igarka, where trains disgorged their human cargo from the camps of Krasnoyarsk and Irkutsk. By the end of that summer, approximately 8,000 people were concentrated at the 2 ends of the proposed line ready to be consumed by the project. The organizational structure was a model of Gulag efficiency. 2 main commands were established, Salekhardlag and Igarklag. Each was subdivided into smaller camp points or lagpunkts spaced every 30 to 40 kilometers along the surveyed route. Colonel Mikhail Maltsev, a man hardened by his experience managing coal mine construction in Vorkuta, was appointed head of Salekhardlag. His counterpart at Igarklag was Lieutenant Colonel Pyotr Sokolov, transferred from Norilsk after expanding the nickel combine there. Each camp point was a self-contained island of misery, barracks, a mess hall, an infirmary, a guard headquarters and workshops for repairing the primitive tools of their labour. The technical blueprint for this impossible railway was drafted by engineers from Giprotrans, the State Institute for the Design of Transport Facilities. The project's chief engineer was Boris Larionov, a veteran of the Baikal-Amur mainline project. In July 1947, Larionov and his team of 23 specialists arrived in Salekhard, setting up their headquarters in a wooden building that once housed the local party committee. Their primary adversary was not distance but the Earth itself. Permafrost, a layer of permanently frozen ground, lay just a half-meter to 2 meters beneath the surface, along nearly the entire route. To build on it was like building on a foundation of ice that threatened to melt at any moment. The engineers proposed a novel solution, thermosiphons, metal piles, filled with an antifreeze solution that would act like cooling rods, preventing the ground beneath the railway bed from thawing. Supplies were a logistical nightmare. In the brief summer months, ships navigated the sea route from Arkhangelsk. In winter, a fragile network of temporary ice roads and aircraft were the only lifelines. In August 1947, a special supply directorate Sevmor-Snap was established in the port of Arkhangelsk. Its commander, Captain Nikolai Belov, was a veteran of organizing polar expeditions. In that first shipping season alone, he managed to deliver 2,300,000 tons of rails, 4,000 reinforced concrete ties, 30 EU series steam locomotives, and a staggering quantity of manual tools, picks, shovels, crowbars, wheelbarrows. The first physical work began in September 1947, with teams pushing out from both ends of the line. From Salekhard, prisoner brigades moved east along the Polui River, carving a path through larch forests and scrub tundra. They cleared a 50-meter-wide corridor, a raw wound in the landscape to accommodate the track and snow fences. They worked in teams of 25, overseen by a single guard armed with a Mosin Nagant rifle and a Nagant revolver. Each brigade was assigned a 500-meter section with a 10-day deadline. The work quotas were calculated for healthy men in their prime, but the reality was a workforce of all ages, many already weakened by malnutrition and despair. Their tools were two-man saws, axes, and grubbing hoes. The felled timber was stacked, destined to become bridges and fortifications along the line. From Igarka, the work pushed west into the marshlands between the Yenisei and Kureka rivers. Here the enemy was not frozen ground, but deep peat bogs, some up to 4 meters deep. Prisoners dug drainage canals by hand, diverting water into natural streams. In the swampiest sections, they built corduroy roads from logs and brushwood. Colonel Sokolov, in his weekly reports to Moscow, noted the extreme difficulty of the work, the constant dampness and the swarms of biting insects in the summer. Productivity here was 30% lower than on the Salekhard section, and the rates of sickness were significantly higher. By the end of the first construction season, the Igarka group had advanced only 18 kilometers, far short of their 30-kilometer goal. The schedules were revised and more bodies were thrown at the problem. The construction of the actual railway embankment began in the spring of 1948. Special drilling teams, a mix of civilian specialists and prisoner technicians, probed the ground, identifying the most treacherous sections. They found 120 locations that would require special thermal insulation and 43 sites where bridges were needed. The most daunting challenge was a planned 470-meter bridge across the Taz River, requiring massive steel trusses of a specialized grade. The design was being handled in Leningrad, the steel fabricated in the Urals. Life for the prisoners was governed by a strict secret directive, issued on the 15th of March 1948. The workday was 10 hours in summer, 8 in winter, with 2 30-minute breaks for meals. Reveille was sounded by a bugle at 5 a.m. in summer, 6 a.m. in winter, followed by 20 minutes for personal hygiene and the morning roll call. Breakfast was watery porridge, black bread, and unsweetened hot tea, about 500 calories. Lunch was a thin soup of vegetables or fish, more porridge and bread, adding another 700 calories. Dinner was a repeat of breakfast. The total daily intake rarely exceeded 1500 calories, a slow-motion starvation diet for men performing heavy physical labor in a brutal climate. The barracks were standard-issue Gulag design, wooden frames, 60 meters long by 12 meters wide, built to house 200 men. A central corridor separated 2-tiered bunks made of rough, unplaned boards. Each prisoner was allotted a mere 1.5 square meters of living space. 4 iron stoves provided heat fed by wood the prisoners harvested themselves. In the dead of winter, the temperature inside rarely rose above 10 degrees Celsius, 50 degrees Fahrenheit, the air thick with the humidity of 200 breathing bodies and no ventilation. Light came from kerosene lamps, 1 for every 20 men. Medical care was a cruel paradox administered by imprisoned doctors under the watch of civilian staff. The chief physician of Salekhard-Igarka was Mikhail Roscoff, a doctor sentenced to 10 years under the infamous Article 58. He had once been the head of a regional hospital. Roscoff, a true hero of this tragedy, organized preventative screenings and managed to reduce the incidence of scurvy by forcing the inclusion of pine needle infusions and local berries in the prisoners' diet. But he was fighting a tidal wave of death. In the first year of construction alone, 3,200 people perished, 4% of the total workforce. As the project entered its second year, the engineering challenges mounted. Boris Larionov and his team, now grown to 47 specialists, battled the permafrost. They began deploying the thermosiphons, driving over 8,000 of the 200 mm diameter pipes filled with an ethylene glycol mixture 5 meters into the ground. It was a high-tech solution in a low-tech hell, requiring special brigades of prisoner welders and fitters. To further insulate the track, they built massive embankments 2 to 4 meters high, using gravel and crushed rock from quarries blasted out of the frozen earth along the route. A network of narrow-gauge railways built parallel to the main line ferried this material around the clock. The blasting was overseen by Engineer Lieutenant Colonel Anatoly Kovalyov, who had experience building fortifications on the Finnish border. Over 1,000 cubic meters of rock were blasted in the first year alone. Bridge construction was a race against the short summer season. The Great Bridge over the Taz River required 4 steel trusses, each weighing 80 tons. They were fabricated at the Uralmashevod plant in Sverdlovsk, shipped by sea to the Arctic, then barged upriver. The assembly was done by prisoner ironworkers under the guidance of engineers from Leningrad. The concrete bridge piers had to be sunk using caissons, massive steel cylinders lowered to the riverbed. Concrete work in the permafrost required special antifreeze additives and preheating of the components. Track laying finally began in the summer of 1949. They used heavy-duty R50 rails specially forged for cold resistance at the Kuznetsk Metallurgical Combine. The reinforced concrete ties were treated to withstand the brutal temperature swings. Prisoner crews working in links of 12 men could lay up to 200 meters of track in a single shift. By the end of 1,949,120 kilometers of track stretched east from Salekhard and 80 kilometers west from Igarka, a mere 16% of the total. The winter of 1949-50 was especially savage, with temperatures plunging to -50 degrees Celsius. The polar night descended and work continued under the ghostly light of kerosene lanterns and bonfires. The workday was cut to 6 hours. Frostbite was rampant. Over 4,000 men were sent to the infirmaries with frozen limbs. By the summer of 1950, the project had swelled to a staggering 1,200 prisoners. More trains arrived, bringing a new influx of souls to feed the railroad. By 1951, the number peaked at over 14,000 prisoners spread across 78 camps. And in a moment of profound historical irony, heavy American machinery began to appear on the construction sites. Caterpillar excavators, International Harvester bulldozers, and Mack dump trucks equipment procured under the Lend-Lease agreement during the war were now being put to use. The very machines built by American workers to defeat fascism were now being operated by Soviet slaves to build a monument to Stalinist paranoia. The project had become a vast, hungry organism. An entire livestock operation was established, raising 3,000 reindeer to provide fresh meat in the winter. Hunting and fishing brigades were formed to supplement the meager diet. But it was never enough. By the autumn of 1951, it was painfully clear that the 1953 deadline was a fantasy. A high-level commission from Moscow, led by Deputy Minister of Internal Affairs Colonel General Ivan Serov, arrived to inspect the project. Their final report sent directly to Stalin was grim. They projected that by the deadline less than half the railway would be complete. The report blamed an underestimation of the geological challenges, chronic supply shortages, and the horrific death rate. In 4 years, 23,000 people had died, 16% of the total workforce drawn into the project. In response, the deadline was extended to 1,956, and the budget was increased by 40%. A new commander, Lieutenant General Alexander Komarovsky, was brought in. He introduced a brutal system of socialist competition brigades that exceeded their quotas, received extra food, and had their sentences reduced. Those who fell behind had their rations cut. Productivity surged by 25%. The summer of 1952 was the most productive season of the entire project. 150 kilometers of track were laid. But by the end of the year, with 420 kilometers complete, another 843 kilometers remained. The political winds in Moscow were shifting. The country was exhausted, and whispers began in the halls of power about the astronomical cost of this railroad of bones. The beginning of 1953 brought a flurry of inspections. In January, a commission led by the first deputy chairman of the Council of Ministers, Vyacheslav Malyshev, arrived. Their secret report questioned the entire economic viability of the project. The cost had ballooned to over 2 billion rubles, 2.5 times the original estimate. Each kilometer of track cost 8 times more than a similar kilometer in the central regions. Furthermore, the completed sections were already failing. Permafrost thaw had buckled the tracks, and spring floods had damaged the bridges. Then on the 5th of March 1953, the unthinkable happened. Joseph Stalin died. The seismic shockwave from this event reached the most remote corners of the Gulag. The project, an extension of one man's iron will, was suddenly an orphan. Rumors of its cancellation spread like wildfire through the camps, and morale plummeted. Sabotage and escape attempts increased. The official death sentence came on the 27th of August, 1953. A decree from the Central Committee ordered all work to cease by November 1. The official reason cited was economic inexpediency. In reality, it was an admission of a catastrophic failure, a monumental waste of money and human life. The shutdown was as swift and brutal as the construction. Work stopped overnight. Equipment was hastily dismantled and shipped out to other projects. The evacuation of the prisoners began. In a final cruel journey, nearly 1,000,000 survivors were loaded onto trains and scattered to other camps across the Gulag system. The camps were stripped of anything valuable. What couldn't be taken was burned or buried. The railroad itself was mothballed. The tracks and ties were left in place, but everything else, signals, telegraph wires, station equipment, was removed. The buildings were boarded up, abandoned to the elements. By the 1st of November 1953, it was over. All that remained were the foundations of barracks and the ghosts of over 1,400,000 people. The abandoned railway, stretching 471 kilometers in 2 disconnected segments, began its slow decay. The tundra began to reclaim its own. A final secret report dated the 30th of December, 1953, tallied the grim accounting. Total cost 2.3 billion rubles. Total lives lost 27400. The average age of the dead was 38. The project became a phantom, a line on a secret map, a steel scar on the face of the earth. For decades, the Dead Road, as it came to be known, was a forbidden subject, its story buried along with its countless victims. It stands today not as a monument to progress, but as a chilling testament to the human cost of absolute power and a dream built on bones. The story of the Dead Road reminds us that history is filled with grand projects that hide immense human suffering. What forgotten histories from your own nation's past do you believe deserve to be brought into the light? Share your thoughts in the comments below.